A Saudi businessman and the most famous arms dealer in the 1970s, he was the richest Arab man with a fortune estimated at $40 billion. His name echoed in the halls of many countries, both Arab and foreign. He owned the largest yacht in the world and a private jet, which could only be described as a flying palace. This man's life was crazy in every sense of the word. He lived in the height of luxury and wealth, but the end was tragic. Imagine, he reached a point where he didn't have enough money to buy a ticket back to his own country. If you want to hear details that are nothing short of insane, I recommend you stick around and watch the video until the end. Enjoy the show. I'm Shamsuddin, and welcome to the channel. The hero of our story today is Adnan Khashoggi, the most famous arms dealer in Arab history. Adnan was born on July 25, 1935, in the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, and he was of Turkish descent. His full name is Mohammed Khashoggi. His father was the Minister of Health in Saudi Arabia and the private doctor of the founder of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz bin Saud. There are some famous people in Adnan's family you may have heard of before, like the famous journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who died in 2018, and also Samira Khashoggi, the ex-wife of the famous Egyptian billionaire Mohammed Al-Fayed, who was also the most famous arms dealer in Egypt. Adnan studied in Saudi Arabia, but later traveled to Alexandria, Egypt, to complete his university studies. After that, he suddenly decided to travel to the U.S. state of California to continue his studies at the College of Commerce. However, after settling in America for a year, he decided to drop out and enter the world of business and trade. At that time, construction companies in Saudi Arabia were struggling with trucks that couldn't handle the desert. Adnan came up with a plan to raise a decent amount of capital, so he signed a contract with the American truck company Kenworth, which made trucks with wide wheels, perfect for the desert. He became the company's agent in Saudi Arabia, rented a number of trucks, and earned a commission from the business amounting to $250,000. Adnan continued working as a middleman between Western companies and Saudi Arabia, fulfilling whatever the kingdom needed, and taking a commission that could reach 15%. But in the 1970s, Adnan decided to take his business to a higher, riskier level with much bigger money involved. He started working as an intermediary between weapons manufacturers and consumer countries, amassing billions from arms deals. His name emerged as one of the biggest and most notorious arms dealers in the world. One of the most important and famous arms deals he was involved in was the Al Yamama deal, a weapons for oil exchange between Saudi Arabia and Britain, worth $20 billion. He was also involved in an arms deal between the U.S. and Iran, known as the Iran-Contra affair, which aimed to help Iran in its war against Iraq. But why did Adnan sell weapons to Iran and not Iraq, even though Iraq is an Arab country? Well, the truth is, it didn't matter to him. For Adnan, it was all about who paid the most. Since Iran was paying more, he sold them the weapons. Whoever paid the highest price, whether it was an Arab or a foreign country, would get the arms. Despite the huge controversy and chatter surrounding his arms trade, Adnan was the richest Arab man in the world. In the 1980s, his fortune was estimated at $40 billion. If you adjust that for today's value, it would be 3 or 4 times that amount. In 1987, his picture was on the cover of Time magazine with the headline, "The Shadowy World of Arms Dealers, The Life and Deals of Adnan Khashoggi." If newspapers wanted to cite an example of extreme wealth, they would mention Adnan's name. Adnan was also known for his love of women and marriage. His first wife was an English woman named Sandra Daly, who converted to Islam and changed her name to Soraya. They had 5 children together, whom he named Hamad, Khaled, Hussein, Omar, and one daughter named Nabila. But his marriage to Soraya ended in 1974. Adnan became even more famous at the time because he paid $900 million in alimony, the largest divorce settlement in history, even to this day. He then married a girl named Laura Biancolini, who became known as Lamia, and she was 17 years old at the time. They had a son together named Ali. He later married an Iranian woman named Shapari, though her last name is very difficult to pronounce. They separated in 2015. These are just a few of the women he married officially, but throughout his life, he was also secretly married to 12 other women, including the American model Jill Dodd. This woman said that Adnan offered her to be his wife for 5 years. Now that we've talked about Adnan's biography, let's get into his possessions. Adnan owned one of the largest yachts in the world, which was 86 meters long. The yacht had his daughter Nabila's name written on it, and it even appeared in one of the scenes in the James Bond film series. As for the number of chefs and servants aboard this yacht, there were 610 people, all just to serve Adnan. His private jet was like a moving palace in every sense of the word. Everyone who boarded the plane was amazed by what they saw. Adnan owned over 12,000 properties, most of them in America, and he even had diamond mines in the U.S. state of Utah. Mines, guys, like something out of the movies. These mines were worth billions of dollars. He also had shares in one of the top telecommunications companies in America. Imagine, for his 50th birthday, he threw a party at his estate on the coast of Marbella, Spain, which was attended by more than 400 people and cost millions of dollars. It was the most extravagant party since the one held by French King Louis XIV for his coronation. But the shocking part is that he dug a river beside his estate, and instead of filling it with water, he filled it with champagne. Imagine a river flowing with champagne. What's even crazier is that the estate was 5,000 acres, something beyond imagination. If you wanted to go from one end of the estate to the other, it would take you a trip. Adnan lived a life of luxury in every form. USA Today wrote that his daily personal spending was $1 million, and personal spending means no investments or anything like that. And since he became world famous, whenever he wanted to travel from one country to another, the president of that country would come to welcome him. As we said, he built relationships with world leaders, and sometimes countries would borrow money from him. It's said that Turkey once borrowed $20 million from him. He would spend massive amounts on movie productions, and it's said that he once spent $150 million on foreign films. If only you had spent that money on something that benefited you or your people. Adnan was the richest Arab man ever, and among Arabs, he was nicknamed the Qarun of our time. By the way, Qarun is a famous figure among Arabs who lived during the time of the Prophet Moses, and, according to Islamic beliefs, is considered the richest man in history. Anyway, Adnan's annual income was $500 million. One day, his daughter Nabila asked him for ice cream and chocolate, but the kind she wanted was only made in France, and the chocolate was in Geneva. So he sent one of his private jets to fetch them, and the trip took 7 hours. Unbelievable. After that, Adnan was imprisoned in Switzerland for being accused of money laundering for the former Philippine dictator's wife. At the same time, he was fighting a legal battle to avoid being expelled from the UK. Luckily for him, all the charges were dropped, and he was acquitted. But the amazing thing is that while he was in prison, gourmet meals were being delivered to him from the Schweizerhof Hotel, so he was living the life of a wealthy man even in jail. On the flip side of Adnan's life, he was obsessed with gambling. He gambled like crazy, and his favorite game was roulette. He would gamble massive amounts of money to guarantee a win and impress the women around him. Imagine, once he lost $500,000 in one go, and that was in the 70s. Adjusted for inflation today, that would be around $2 million, or even more. But Adnan didn't play his cards right. Despite the enormous wealth he had, he didn't plan for hard times or the future. He spent money on things that had no benefit, like alcohol, gambling, and extravagant parties. His empire started to crumble little by little. So, what was the main reason for this collapse? First, on the western side in 1984, there was an operation carried out by Mossad called Operation Moses, aimed at relocating African Jews to Israel. At that time, Adnan, Israeli Prime Minister Sharon, the Israeli security chief, and Sudanese President Jafar Nimeri, who was a close friend of Adnan's, agreed to smuggle African Jews through Sudan to Israel, all in exchange for a large sum of money. All the parties agreed, and the operation was a success. But afterward, Adnan gave an interview to an Israeli newspaper, claiming that he was the one responsible for relocating the African Jews to Israel. At that time, Adnan was at the peak of his wealth, to the point where he didn't see anyone. But later, he faced problems with the US and Israel. It's said that certain groups were out to get him, so they leveled fraud charges against him, accusing him of manipulating the shares of the telecommunications company he had invested in. His wealth continued to decline, especially after the value of real estate in the US, and Europe plummeted, costing him over $500 million. Eventually, the diamond mines he owned in Utah were shut down. It's said at the time that this was the work of sabotage, as the losses from the mines were estimated at over $2 billion. Along with all these events, Adnan was in London, continuing to gamble until his accounts in London banks were depleted due to his huge losses. He ended up owing £8 million to the Ritz Casino and Hotel. Also, when he faced financial crises, he was forced to sell the yacht to the Sultan of Brunei, who then sold it to former U.S. President Donald Trump for $29 million. Trump used it for 2 years before selling it to Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. On the Arab side, the Iraq-Iran war started in the early 80s. As we mentioned earlier, since Adnan was an arms dealer, and the most important thing for him was money, he sold weapons to Iran, not out of love for Iran or hatred for Iraq, but according to the principle, whoever pays more is my friend. It's said that due to Adnan's support for Iran, Saudi Arabia stopped dealing with him and his companies. During that time, Saddam Hussein said, "Our relationship with Saudi Arabia is bigger than Adnan Khashoggi."
الكلام الذي نشر عن عدنان خاشقجي وبعثني لكي أقول لك إنه علاقتنا أعلى من تفاصيل الذي يحاول البعض أن يدسه على علاقتنا.
What made the West gradually abandon him was that Saudi Arabia started sending its students abroad for education. Around that time, the number of people engaging in trade between the West and Gulf countries increased, especially in the arms trade. Many people became alternatives to Adnan, and Arab countries could deal with them. Adnan's business empire began to gradually decline, and competitors started appearing everywhere. As the losses grew, he slowly faded from the spotlight until his companies went completely bankrupt. Literally, the man was left with not a penny. At that point, he decided to travel to Saudi Arabia, but he didn't even have the money for a ticket from London. Imagine, the man who used to spend $1 million a day reached the point where he couldn't afford a ticket back to his own country. Luckily, while in London, he ran into a businessman who bought him a ticket to Jeddah. When he arrived in Saudi Arabia, he was in a pitiful state and started asking people for money just to get food and drink. His health declined significantly. Here's a picture of Adnan after arriving in Saudi Arabia. As for his wife, Soraya, who got $900 million in their divorce settlement, she was working in a flower shop with one of their sons. This is a picture of her on her way to work. The point of this story isn't to shame or mock anyone, but to take a lesson. After the news of his bankruptcy spread, one of his old friends in the business world came to him and said, "Adnan, I haven't forgotten the friendship we had. God sent me to give you a monthly allowance just for you to eat and drink." One day, one of his wives asked him about the worst day of his life. He answered, "One day, a worker who used to work for me came to me. He had tough circumstances in his country, and his family needed money. He came to me and asked for a loan, saying he would repay it from his salary monthly. But I disrespected him, and because of his persistence and begging, I got very angry and fired him." His wife asked him why he did that, since the man only asked for a loan. He answered, "I'm not responsible for the descendants of Adam." She replied that the man asked for a loan and would have paid it back, but Adnan told her, "At the time, I was drunk and didn't care about him. And I asked him why he hadn't saved from his salary earlier. But the strange thing is, when I told him he was fired, the man raised his hands to the sky and cursed me, saying, 'I ask God that before I die, I see you asking people for money. And as you can see now, I've lost everything, and the only income I have is the allowance my friend gives me.' One month, I went to my friend to collect my allowance, and when I arrived at his mansion, I waited in the guest area. My friend wasn't there that day, so he sent one of his workers to give me the money. While I was sitting in the guest area, the worker I had fired entered the room and gave me the money. After he was fired, the man went and worked for his friend. Then Adnan looked into his wife's eyes and told her that this was the worst day of his life. When I first heard this story, I thought it was a lie, but I found many Arabic documentaries confirming this from both Adnan and the worker he had fired. Anyway, a few years later, Adnan's health worsened further, and he developed Parkinson's disease, the tremor disorder that made him unable to walk. After that, Saudi Arabia sent him to London for treatment. After all those friendships and connections with world leaders and top businessmen, Adnan died alone in London in 2017 at the age of 81, with only a few people attending his funeral. This story made me realize that the good you do, even if people don't see or know about it, will come back to you one day. And the same goes for the bad. So, don't try to wrong anyone. Embrace good values and principles, because what truly makes you loved and respected by people is your character, not what you own, dear viewer. And with that, we've come to the end of our story. See you in the next video. Peace.